Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Sniper on the Eastern Front, Chapter 13. Another anonymous statistic. Many of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division's units were encircled by the Romanians and Russians in the closing days of August, but they fought on. The 144th Regiment did what it could to assist these pockets of resistance, mounting courageous attacks that often broke through and enabled their trapped comrades to escape. Sepp accompanied a patrol sent out to relieve a small detachment that had been defending a pass against the Russians for 3 days and had been cut off from retreat by Romanian troops. The Romanians consisted of 10 men with submachine guns and carbines. Though numerically inferior to the defenders, they could prevent their escape because of their superb field of fire and cleverly chosen positions. The Romanians themselves clearly felt safe and did not expect to be attacked. Luckily, the advance of the German patrol was concealed by thick undergrowth and went unseen by the Romanians, whose whereabouts were unknown to them. When Sepp and the patrol sergeant finally spotted them through their binoculars, it was with some relief that they realized their arrival had not been detected. This provided them with the decisive element of surprise. Throwing grenades and following them with volleys of machine pistol fire and well-aimed carbine shots, the Romanians were annihilated within seconds. There was no escape. But this success didn't solve the problem yet, for an open field still lay between themselves and the cut-off detachment, which was clearly visible to the Russian and within easy reach of their weapons. Alerted by the sound of gunfire to their rear, the 7 remaining defenders now realized that unlooked-for help was close at hand. Through his binoculars, Sepp saw them talking and gesticulating to each other, but how could they reach them? Then, while defenders and relief force alike considered their options, there suddenly came the whooshing sound of Russian heavy mortars, which shattered the silence. The Soviets had finally brought up heavy weapons to clear the pass. The patrol members threw themselves flat and hugged the ground, but the salvo was aimed at the defensive positions rather than them. With dull thuds, the exploding shells burst across the ground, the wall of fire rolling steadily towards the German positions. In his binoculars, Sepp saw the defenders' faces distorted by panic. The patrol that had hoped to relieve them was unable to do anything. The defenders now had no more than the slimmest of chances to escape certain death by flight across the open ground to their rear. The patrol could only look on helplessly. Shortly before the first mortar shells hit their positions, the 7 men jumped up and sprinted across the field, to be knocked down by well-aimed gunshots in their backs one after another. Instead of zigzagging, they had tried to reach the forest in a straight line. Sepp immediately recognized the signature of a Russian marksman equipped with a Tokarev 40 self-loading gun. He had seen these weapons and had even tried out a captured example. It wasn't as precise as a repeating rifle like the German Model 43, but it was reliable and improved an experienced marksman's rate of fire considerably. Sepp had learned from his battalion armorer that there was a marksman's version of this weapon with a telescopic sight similar to the one on his original Russian rifle. The next salvo of mortar fire plowed up the German positions and tore the fallen riflemen apart, burying most of them beneath a shower of stones and soil. Then there was a sudden silence, broken by the screams of the few injured men still alive. 2 members of the patrol volunteered to make a rescue attempt, and carefully using what little cover there was, they worked their way forward to their comrades. When they reached the first of them, one of the rescuers raised himself a little higher than was wise and was immediately hit in the breast by a bullet. Through his glasses, Sepp saw a fountain of blood spray from him for several seconds. Obviously, the Russian sniper's explosive bullet had destroyed an artery near to the heart. The rifleman's body trembled and twitched in his death throes. Sepp desperately scanned the Russian positions, but they remained hidden and unreachable by the rifleman's weapons. The presence of the Russian marksmen meant that another attempt to rescue their comrades was hopeless. Only by luck was the second rifleman able to get back unhurt. Meanwhile, the screams and moans of the injured faded away as death released them, except for one, who from the Lancers' experience they knew had been hit in a kidney. His agonized screaming was only interrupted by short periods when he slipped into unconsciousness. But he clung desperately to life and the hope of rescue. Yet, no matter how the patrol looked at the situation, there was no way to rescue him without risking more lives. Now, the screams broke off and they heard the wounded man call feebly for help. The men saw him raise one hand, seeking help. Seconds later, the hand was torn off by a shot from the Russian marksman's rifle. Bloodily shredded like a broken branch, the stump continued to wave in the air. The Russian sniper obviously wanted to teach the Lancers a lesson in horror. Again the screams began. The sergeant waved Sepp over to him, put his hands on his shoulder and looked at him gravely. "I can't force you, I can only beg you, Sepp, and I know that what I ask is a very hard thing, but I beg you, release our comrade with a decent shot. You're the only one who can do it at this distance." This was a situation Sepp had always dreaded would come. He had often seen the Russians shoot their wounded comrades in no man's land, but on the German side such behavior was unusual because such systematic killing would have seriously demoralized their men. It was an unwritten rule in the Wehrmacht to always rescue injured men if possible. The only exception was mercy killing carried out at the request of wounded men in hopeless situations. Sepp had shuddered when he'd seen this done during the past few months, when terribly wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved begged comrades to kill them to spare them any further suffering. It was expected that men left behind would be tortured and killed by the Soviets, since it wasn't feasible for enemy assault troops to give them any help. Sepp was still hesitating, but the others urged him to do what the sergeant asked. "Come on, man, do something. You can't leave him like that. Shit, release the poor devil." Unwillingly, beset by his scruples, Sepp rested the carbine on a rolled tent square. The distance was about 80 meters, but the wounded man's head was hidden in the grass and his body was partly concealed by a fold in the ground and several large stones. Sepp tried to aim carefully, but he was trembling at the thought of what he was about to do, and a choke of emotion welled up inside him. Suddenly, he became aware of the monstrousness, the absurdness of war, and the constant pointless killing. Fighting had now become an end in itself. But now that the anonymity of his target could not salve his conscience, he had real scruples for the first time about what he did. He felt a wave of compassion course through him and sought for answers that didn't exist. He had allowed that momentum of war to subdue his morality beneath its yoke. Like many others, he had resigned himself to his duty as a sniper because of honest patriotism, and with that duty he had accepted his fate, mortgaging his future peace of mind by accepting indelible responsibility for his selfless duty. It took mere seconds for these wildly circling thoughts to race through his mind, but it seemed like an eternity to him. Then he arrived at the only possible decision, to bring a swift end to his comrade's suffering. Sepp forced himself to be calm, loaded a B cartridge, took aim at the twitching head, and waited for a chance to shoot. Suddenly, the wounded man's body stiffened and his scream became hoarse. His head was still. Sepp's sight settled on the ear of the dying man, and with a slight tremble of his finger, Sepp pulled the trigger. Their comrade's head burst into a bloody fountain, and a paralyzing silence descended. The Russians went quiet. Obviously, they hadn't expected such a course of action, and had decided it was safer to stay where they were. The rifleman took advantage of this breathing space to slip away undisturbed. No one said anything, and nobody looked at each other. Silent and subdued, the Lancers crept away, each of them relieved that it was not he who had to do it. It was the marksman who'd done what was necessary and now paid the price of inner conflict and isolation. Over the next few days they continued to search for pockets of resistance in need of rescue, but their failure in the past, minor episode of war though it was, would haunt Sepp in a strange way for the rest of his days. Soon after their return he was ordered to accompany another patrol seeking a cut-off detachment. By now, the course of the front line had become quite confused, and they had to cross a minefield on the way. The previous day, a group of pioneers had cleared a narrow path through the mines and marked it with small sticks. Despite this, they felt uneasy and crept along almost on tiptoe and with their breath held. About 90 minutes later, they had crossed the minefield and had carefully worked their way through a stretch of undergrowth. The old hands among them had developed a feel for the ground and for danger, so the patrol's advance guard was already on the alert when it encountered another unexpected minefield, this time fitted with tripwires. These always indicated there was a Russian position nearby. Carefully using every bit of cover available, they tried to go around the minefield, but this proved more problematic and time-consuming than they had anticipated. In the meantime, dusk had come down and they were obliged to withdraw, since moving about in a minefield in the dark was extremely dangerous. But before they did, the patrol leader wanted to take a look from a nearby hilltop and he waved Sepp over to join him. From there, they had a clear view of the well-built Russian positions. While they observed these through their binoculars, Sepp noticed a movement in the bushes about 20 meters away and saw a pale-colored patch in the gloom. Looking closer, he saw that it was a squatting Russian with his pants down, relieving himself. "Sepp, do you see that too?" whispered the sergeant. "There's an Ivan over there squatting and shitting. If you can hit him, the others will get a proper fright. They think we're in a totally different area. I'll get back to the others, put off your shot for as long as possible, and then follow me." His comrade disappeared, and Sepp took the Russian into his crosshairs. "I'll let him lay down the muck, and then he's due," Sepp thought. Suddenly, a cynical comic rhyme came into his head. "The lightning shall hit while you shit." The wit of war. The distance was about 150 meters. To be sure of hitting his enemy in the breast, he aimed at his throat. Then he breathed deeply, concentrated, and fired. At the very same moment, the Russian got up, so the projectile hit his lower abdomen, sliced through his intestines, and left his body via a big hole in his back. He cried like an animal in utter panic. Startled by the shot, his comrades emerged from their dugout and returned a wild, unaimed fire. Sepp crawled away backwards and hurried after his comrades. At the crack of dawn the next day, they were on their way again to look for their missing comrades. But now they had another order too. If possible, they should capture a Russian and bring him back for interrogation. Using paths they knew well, they crept towards the enemy. The Russians in turn seemed to have decided to get a better idea of the enemy's position, but they set out later than the riflemen, and the two patrols encountered one another just ahead of the Soviet lines. Since the Lancers were moving more carefully, they spotted the Russians first, so they had the advantage of surprise on their side. In addition, they were equipped with another new gun that had only become available in small numbers over the past few weeks. This was the Sturmgewehr 44, which was a cross between a machine pistol and a carbine, with a lever which switched it from semi-automatic to fully automatic mode. It fired a special shortened carbine cartridge called Pistolenpatrone 43, the magazine holding 30 rounds. This ammunition had sufficient power to travel up to 300 meters. The Sturmgewehr was also more comfortable to fire than a 98K carbine because the cartridge was weaker and part of its recoil energy was used in the automatic reload process, whereas the powerful recoil of the 98K led to painful bruises in the shoulder after 40 or 50 shots, even amongst men used to using it. This was one reason why few hits were scored with the 98K in battle, because soldiers were more concerned with avoiding the recoil than in firing well-aimed shots. In the ensuing short and violent fight with the Russian patrol, the Sturmgewehrs proved their worth. Within a few minutes, all their enemies were dead or seriously wounded without any loss on their own side. They had been so thorough, in fact, that there were no survivors fit enough to be taken back for questioning. The riflemen had no qualms about dealing with the wounded Russians. A hard-boiled Lancer, insensitive about such things, shot the few Russians still alive with his pistol, while the rest of the patrol searched the dead for usable information in the form of paybooks, passes, and identification cards bearing tactical insignia. But the Russians interrupted proceedings with heavy mortar fire from their nearby positions without any consideration for their comrades, and the riflemen had to depart as quickly as possible. They dashed along the edge of the minefield they had discovered the previous day and into a bushy area from which, after going a few hundred meters, they suddenly saw the position occupied by the comrades they had been looking for. But they saw immediately that they were all dead. After having fired their last rounds, they had obviously been killed in hand-to-hand combat. They scanned the position from a group of bushes, fuller and closer examination not being possible because there was so little cover between them and the Russian lines. In addition, they could hear noises nearby and had to assume that the enemy was somewhere in the immediate vicinity. While Sepp observed the area through his binoculars, something caught his eye. There it was, a brand new Gebirgsjäger cap, its tin Edelweiss badge shining in the sun. He glanced up at the tattered peak of his own totally worn-out cap and immediately decided to retrieve this other one as a replacement. He crept carefully towards the object of his desire. There were just a few meters to go when he suddenly saw the body of a comrade to whom the cap had belonged. His blank eyes were staring at the sky, and his chest was torn apart by so many splinters that bits of rib were poking out. Hundreds of flies were swarming around the corpse. The chain of his identity disc had slipped up around his ears, and the disc lay beside his head. When Sepp reached him, he put his own cap over the dead man's face and put on the new one. He was pleased to find that it fitted perfectly. At that moment he heard a vehicle approaching and realized it was high time to leave. The thought of taking the dead man's ID tags didn't come to him until it was too late. By the time he thought of it, he was in the bushes and the Russian vehicle was too close, so he couldn't go back. And with that, the dead soldier became just another anonymous statistic in the list of men missing in action. It would have taken only a moment to grab the tags so that the man's relatives could have known his fate. But all Sepp had thought about was the new cap. This unintentional act of selfishness haunted him for the rest of his life. As the whole of Romania became caught up in the bitter fighting, only the resolutely defended positions of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division stood in the way of the mighty Red Army. Despite its inferiority in men and material, the division held on for as long as possible so that the German front line could be restabilized, but the Soviets were eventually able to push their way through by sheer weight of numbers. The Germans therefore resorted to ambush tactics as the Russians tried to advance through the narrow mountain passes. The conditions were ideal for marksmen who were able to prepare well-camouflaged positions overlooking the enemy's known route of advance and to fire at him at predetermined ranges. Even with inferior forces, the German defense was consequently successful because the enemy could not deploy to make best use of his numerical superiority within the confines of the narrow valleys, but instead had to fight his way through meter by meter and suffered heavy losses accordingly. Sepp scored up to 20 hits a day in these battles, although few of them found their way into his official total. It was in early September that Captain Kloss showed Sepp a message from High Command concerning Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS marksmen. By order of the Führer, a special marksman's badge had been introduced in 3 grades. The first grade was awarded for 20 confirmed kills, the second with a silver cord for 40 kills, and the third with a gold cord for 60 kills. The new embroidered oval badge should be worn on the right forearm of the uniform jacket above any other badges. But obviously, no sane marksman would ever wear such a badge in battle. The meaning of the badge would soon have become known to the enemy, so that wearing one would have been tantamount to suicide. As before, kills in straightforward fighting did not count towards these badges, and Heinrich Himmler decreed that all kills scored up to that time had to be erased from the record as a gift to the Führer. Counting had to start again from scratch. However, as a reward for their good work, the marksmen were each to receive an Iron Cross 2nd class or 1st class if they already possessed a 2nd class cross. Sepp received his own Iron Cross 2nd class a few days later. In reality, this official recognition of marksmen who had been reviled up till then resulted from the steadily diminishing output of the German armaments industry and was clearly intended to encourage the stalwart resistance of such lone warriors. Armed with no more than a rifle and with no regard for their personal safety, it was hoped that such men might be able to compensate for the army's ever-increasing lack of weapons and equipment. At the same time as the Soviets maintained their pressure on the virtually impregnable positions of the riflemen, they managed to break through into Hungary in another sector. As a result, encirclement once again threatened the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division, and it was left with no choice but to abandon its positions and withdraw to the river Maros, 200 kilometers away. The riflemen pulled back as quickly as they could, marching by night and fighting holding actions against their Russian pursuers by day. While the battalion marched, Captain Kloss hurried ahead to plan out their positions for the next day. Sepp had to accompany him because Kloss regarded him as an experienced and tough soldier on whom he could depend. He was something like a bodyguard for the captain. As a regular officer, Kloss had been taught to ride during his training, so in order to travel cross-country without giving himself away by the noise of an engine, he took to riding a horse during his daily explorations. Sepp therefore had to be mounted too and rode one of the tough pannier steppe horses that had formed the backbone of the Wehrmacht's logistical effort on the Eastern Front since 1943. Unlike his commander, however, Sepp had no experience of riding beyond owning a rocking horse as a child. So, when he swung himself up on the unsaddled horse for the first time, it was with very mixed emotions. He sprawled across its back like an ape, pressing his legs together as tightly as he could to hold himself in place. Despite this, however, he bounced about like a rubber ball, and the horse moved, and he saw a glint of malicious humor in Kloss's eyes as he waited for him to fall off. But Sepp was determined not to show himself up, and he bravely clung on for the entire ride, which lasted about an hour. After exploring the new positions, he begged that he might take the job of rearguard, because there was no way he could have made it back on the horse. The rough cloth of his uniform had rubbed his crotch raw on the ride out. When the rest of the unit eventually came up, he immediately visited the battalion doctor and asked for his discreet help in a delicate matter. The doctor gave him a tin of penaten cream to ease his immediate discomfort, but under no circumstances could he get back on a horse for the next few days. Grinning widely, Kloss simulated sympathy and switched to a BMW motorbike and sidecar for his scouting missions. Kloss occupied the sidecar while Sepp sat in the pillion seat behind the rider. He left his gun behind because his back had been badly bruised by the carbine repeatedly hitting him as he bounced about on the horse. In its place, he carried an MP40. Rattling along the road, they met an infantry combat group that was also withdrawing and was accompanied by 2 assault guns that were still fit to fight. Talking to the officers, Kloss learned that a patrol had seen a Russian tank somewhere along this road, so a high degree of caution was called for. A few minutes later they rode on, and just as they passed the foremost assault gun, it suddenly stopped and fired. The motorcycle was hardly 2 meters from the muzzle at the time, and Sepp felt as if a bomb had exploded in his head. Blinded by the muzzle flash, he was thrown from the saddle and into the bushes at the side of the road and was briefly knocked out. When he came to several seconds later, he was lying in the grass with every bone in his body aching, his head ringing, and his ears whistling. Directly in front of him, the motorcycle rider was rolling around likewise concussed, while Kloss sat alone in the sidecar, gawking at them. They were all too shell-shocked to move as a short fight with the Russian vanguard unfolded around them. The enemy soon pulled back and the riflemen received help a few minutes later. But it took them more than half an hour to recover sufficiently to continue on their way, and it took days for the whistling in Sepp's ears to stop. It was not this episode that forced him back onto a horse, but the general circumstances that now prevailed at the front. By 1944, the German army was dependent on hundreds of thousands of horses to maintain its ailing logistics and guarantee it any form of mobility. Lack of petrol, huge losses, and insufficient standardization of parts had resulted in the numbers of serviceable vehicles declining dramatically. Infantry units in particular were often without any motor vehicles at all. Thus it was that the hard-working and genial pannier horses became so essential to the German army's logistical survival. So, making a virtue of necessity, Sepp sought instruction from a comrade who had been a farmer and knew about horses, and after about a week of practice, he was able to ride sufficiently well that he got through the remainder of his cavalry excursions without further mishap. Soon afterwards, a supply lorry reached them with a few replacements and some much-needed ammunition. Sepp received a message from the battalion weapons and equipment sergeant saying that he had exciting news and that Sepp should come and see him. When he got there, he saw before him 10 brand-new Model 43 self-loading rifles and 3 small green-painted boxes containing 4 times Model ZF-41 sights. The sergeant had received written orders from the battalion armorer to fit the sights to the 3 most accurate of the new weapons and mark each mounting with its rifle's serial number. Knowing that Sepp had handled such weapons and sights on his marksman's course, he told him that he needed his help to check the rifles and pick out the best 3. Finding the best 3 didn't take long, but when Sepp was offered one of them, he declined because the ZF-41 sight was inferior to the one on his K98K, whether it be in brightness, optical clarity, or range of vision. But he nevertheless asked the sergeant to hold back one of the guns for him, since he recognized its tactical advantages in certain fighting situations. A couple of proven sharpshooters received the other 2 weapons. But marking the mountings with the rifle serial numbers proved to be quite difficult, the special steel from which they were manufactured being so hard that the numbers they stamped on were barely legible. After a hard night march, the riflemen picked out their new positions in the early morning light and dug themselves in. The Russians were hard on their heels, and they were expecting the first patrols at any moment. Sepp accompanied Captain Kloss on a last informal inspection of the defenses. Suddenly, a single shot whizzed through the morning silence and hit a machine gun position about 5 meters ahead of them. Ducking down, they sprinted to the trench, where a rifleman sat holding his cap in his hand, its Edelweiss badge ripped off. Sepp recognized the signs instantly, a Russian marksman. The Lancer, having been at the front for only a few days, saw his commander and wanted to report where the shot had come from. Before Sepp could stop him, he had risen again to point over the edge of the trench, but the first word was not out of his mouth before Sepp had leapt at him and thrown him to the ground. At the very same moment, the Russian fired again, and his shot glanced across the top of the falling rifleman's head. Blood sprayed everywhere as the bullet tore a piece of bone from the left side of his skull. Despite the severity of his wound, the Lancer did not lose consciousness. Sepp and the second machine gunner took the field dressing from his pocket and bandaged him. Then Kloss took him back to the battalion aid station. All the while he stuttered. What happened? Who hit me? Am I hurt? Then he suddenly looked at Kloss wide-eyed and asked, Dad, will you take me home now? Mom will be waiting for us. It sent a shiver down Kloss's spine, but he answered, Stay calm, lad. You just fell down. We'll go home now, and everything will be fine. Sepp stayed in the machine gun position. Word that there was a Russian sniper somewhere spread like wildfire through the riflemen's lines, and they became alarmed. They looked at Sepp to solve the problem for them. Marksmen were repeatedly put under this sort of pressure. The officers in particular always expected them to fearlessly and successfully execute every task with which they were presented, regardless of feasibility. If the marksman succeeded, he'd just done his job, but if he failed, he was often reviled for cowardice or incompetence. Yet he could not perform miracles every time, especially when fighting against enemy marksmen. Though Sepp had sometimes sensed such unpleasant pressure, he was lucky enough to have unusually sensible superiors. Whenever possible, he constructed himself a well-camouflaged observation post each time the unit moved to new positions, and he moved to the one he'd prepared here as soon as a replacement machine gunner arrived to relieve him. From there, he hoped to trace the Soviet. But his opponent was a cunning devil, because suddenly he had just vanished. The day passed in strained watchfulness, but nothing more happened, and in the evening the riflemen once again abandoned their positions just as the first Russian machine guns started barking across no man's land. A few days later they came to the wooded valley of the river Maros. Kloss's daily reconnaissance of their next defensive position was over, and Sepp was trotting along surrounded by his comrades. All of them were chronically overtired, and they were walking as if they were in a trance. Only the guard detachments remained alert. A vanguard of 5 men was marching about 50 meters ahead of them. Suddenly, a dull explosion roused the riflemen from their exhaustion. Everybody was immediately awake, and they all leapt for cover. Jumping into a ditch, Sepp saw one of his comrades being thrown down by the explosion and hit by a second detonation as he struck the ground. Sepp realized instantly that this was no ambush. The rifleman had stepped on a mine. His warning spread rapidly among the survivors, and everybody began to edge their way forward as carefully as possible. Since Sepp was at the front, he worked his way over to the wounded man with a medical orderly. In the gleam of his flashlight, the dying man's face shone white as chalk. No sound came from his lips, and his eyes were already staring unfocused at the threshold of eternity. The first mine had torn off his lower left leg, and when he had hit the ground, his backside had detonated the second mine, which had blown apart his behind and his thighs. The bloody tissue was trembling like jelly. Small fountains of blood throbbed from his ruptured arteries. Splintered bones poked out from the deadly wounds. Even as they reached him, the mortally injured rifleman sighed, gave a last convulsive shudder, and died. In this war there was no time for ritual anymore. The dead soldier was just a corpse, and they left him where he fell. The medical orderly just took his identity disc. The rest of the troop had meanwhile formed a single file behind the 2 men on all fours, who carefully searched the ground ahead for further mines. It later transpired that they had walked into a minefield laid by withdrawing Hungarian troops to cover their own retreat. It took the riflemen more than 5 hours to cover a few hundred meters, with everybody trying to follow the exactly same footsteps as the man in front, but they got through without any further losses. Fortunately, such encounters with mines were rather rare. Since the Germans were constantly retreating, it was primarily they who laid minefields in order to delay the pursuing Russians, while the swiftly advancing Soviets rarely felt the need to safeguard their own positions in this way. This incident reawakened the riflemen from their apathy, and thereafter they kept their eyes peeled for evidence of mines. When they reached their new positions, they saw that one bushy section was strewn with suspicious little mounds that indicated something being buried. They knew that an Hungarian regiment had been stationed in this area, so they assumed the worst and taped the area off as a warning to the rest of the battalion that was following behind them. Since the area could not be left out of a defensive scheme, it was decided to partially clear it, and under the guidance of pioneers, teams were formed to remove the mines. They crept in on all fours and began to prod these suspicious mounds with their fingers and the tips of their bayonets. Suddenly, several riflemen let out howls of disgust. Their mines turned out to be piles of shit. They were in a latrine and not a minefield. The division had hardly reached its new frontline positions around Deda in Hungary when the enemy attacked in strength, maintaining a concerted offensive against the riflemen's positions from September the 24th until October the 8th. These hard-fought battles resulted in many losses, but the Gebirgsjäger managed to break the attack and maintain their positions. However, the Soviets succeeded in breaking through south of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division, and with the integrity of the front line again compromised, the division had to abandon the positions it had sacrificed so many lives to defend. It fell back to a new defensive line along the river Theiss. The situation was complicated by the fact that Hungary was no longer a reliable ally. Its political faction had polarized and parts of its army had defected to the Russians, though other units remained unconditionally loyal to the Germans. Further decisive weakening of the German front was inevitable under these circumstances. It was now that Sepp and his comrades began to see columns of civilian refugees fleeing alongside withdrawing Wehrmacht units, not just people of German origin, but also many Hungarians opposed to communism. With that, the war became even more stressful, because these civilians often got caught up in the fighting and the Lancers were unable to help them and had to watch them suffer and die too. With that, every soldier ceased to see any sense of duty in what he did. The fighting had been reduced to a mere struggle for survival. On the huge Hungarian plains known as the Puszta, the numerically superior Russian armored units developed their offensive. In order to maintain contact with the main body of the retreating German army, Combat Group Wöhler, to which the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division belonged, had to drive a path through the Russians to the town of Nyíregyháza. Bitter battles developed, into which the columns of refugees were drawn without mercy. Since Hungary's political about-face was only half-hearted, it was not regarded as an ally by the invading Russians, and the Red Army moved in as conquerors, providing the population and the retreating Germans alike with a bitter foretaste of their upcoming defeat. There were many incidents of extreme brutality perpetrated against civilians by Russian soldiers, while the corpses of horribly tortured German soldiers became a routine sight.
Well, not much to say here apart from the continuing horror that is the Eastern Front. And now they have to worry about mines and refugees too, as if the Russians weren't bad enough. It's not getting easier one bit, that's for sure. That being said, waiting for the next episode is indeed easy, and I will see you then. Cheers.